Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. This is a Friday Reads. Got a few books because it's been a while since I've recorded a video. So the books I'm talking about today are The Red Arrow by William Brewer, Audrey Magee's debut novel The Undertaking, She of the Colony, Dulce Maria Cardoso, Violeta Among the Stars, Portuguese novelist. This was translated by Angel Julia Quintana. And my second book for Women in Translation in August, Unica Zurn, The Man of Jasmine and Other Texts, translated by Malcolm Green, and this was gifted to me by Zina over at Beating Around the Books. Rian Hughes, The Black Locomotive, a novel with graphics. It's not strictly a graphic novel because there is a lot of text, but there are a lot of graphics. So this was the guy who wrote XX. Laura Sims, Looker. What's that? 6 or 7 books? 6 books. Okay. So I'm going to start with The Red Arrow. So I saw Curtis over at Curtis Books and Books talk about this. And it's one of those sort of unprepossessing books that go under the radar. Never heard of the author, never heard of the book. But Curtis mentioned it was about a ghostwriter, which is something that's always interested me, and is sort of a putative novel of mine that I've written, I think, about 10,000 words of, but it's not the next one up on deck. So I bought it, and actually this is hugely impressive. It's got one of the best treatments of sort of depression that I've seen in literature, in modern literature, and it's also has a very, very stern inner critic or a voice that's always tearing the character down, which is a very unfortunate combination for the character. I just thought the representation of both of those facets was brilliantly done. So it's about a youngish author who started off wanting to become a painter, wasn't really getting anywhere, and increasingly turned his hand towards writing prose. He wrote a book of short stories, each about a different character in a scout troop in West Virginia where he hailed from. And the book became a hit. And at that point, he is now approached by agents and publishers, and he has the idea that now, that book has begun to establish him. Now he's going to become a proper author, a literary writer. And he wants to write this sort of epic book about a chemical spill in the waters in West Virginia that he experienced as a child. But the problem is that before, when he wrote the short stories, he wasn't trying to be a writer. He was just writing the stories. Now he's trying to be a writer, and that's put a whole block on him. And he does tons and tons of procrastinating research that have nothing to do with it. And he spends all of his advance basically arranging his wedding to his girlfriend in Italy, and their honeymoon there. And the publishers obviously are none too thrilled with this, and they want their money back. And he has no money. And he gets a gig as a ghostwriter for this Italian physicist. There is a real life Italian sort of pop science physicist whose name I can't remember, so I assume it's based on that. And because he's writing about somebody else's life, he is able to be able to write, because he's not trying to be a writer. He's writing about somebody else's life. And indeed, one of the memories he has, he wonders if it was his genuine memory or actually a memory of the guy he's writing about. And it's all going well. He's managing to sort of pay back his debt by doing this ghostwriting, chapter by chapter. Each sort of chapter pays off a bit of the debt. But unfortunately, the physicist disappears, drops off the face of the earth. And it's on his honeymoon in Italy that he decides he's going to try and track down. He's got like a sort of intuitive guess that the physicist has holed up back in his family home in Modena, in Italy. So he takes a break for one day from his honeymoon, with his wife's permission, to go to Modena to meet the physicist, or to see if the physicist is there, and see if he can come to an arrangement to complete the book. So that's sort of the plot. It's a lot about, though, his childhood in West Virginia, this chemical spill, He goes back to visit his father in West Virginia and his brother and his relationship with them. It's about his relationship with his wife. But the best bits are this critical voice who just shoots him down the whole time about being a writer. Also the fact that he wants to be a father with his partner, but he just knows because he screws everything up in life, he doesn't want, it's bad enough he's going to ruin his partner's life. He can't bring himself to ruin the life of someone who's not even born yet. This is the strength of the inner critic, the voice inside that has on him, which he calls the miss. I mean, Churchill had his black dog of depression, and this character has that, but he also has this mist of just, dragging everything down into the mud, and it's really brilliantly portrayed. So it's a really, really good book. I'm just going to read a couple of bits which are sort of more on the ghostwriting side of things. As I say, he couldn't tell if a memory was his or that of the physicist. This is how he's able to write. He couldn't write his book on the chemical spill, but he is able to write the life of the physicist. We are histories of ourselves, narratives, write the physicist, and so it seems that those 8 hours spent each day writing a life I did not live, as if I was the one who lived it, provided me, if only briefly, with a reprieve from my own torturous narrative, from myself, and when I was away from myself there was nothing there for the depression to cling to and manipulate. But always, as soon as I was done for the day, the mist swept back in and I was lost in its haze. And then when he does track down the physicist in his family home, the physicist sort of tells him that they're sort of cut from the same cloth, that they're almost mirror images of each other. When we were working on the memoir, he began, the process was fine. I liked it, even with all the other work I had to do. You did very well. But then there was an issue. As I started proofing your renditions of my memories, they became my memories. Not just became, they destroyed my memories and replaced them. I couldn't get the originals back. Even if I listened to my recordings, they wouldn't return. It said every memory was now filtered through your version of my voice. Even when I tried to remember in Italian, it was not my Italian, but Italian as you would speak it. So it's a really interesting study on the nature of self and reality. When he's trying to get to grips with understanding the nature of his sort of twin persecutors of depression and the inner critic, he learns from the physicist's writing that the past is grief for things lost, and the future is just anxiety about things that are going to happen, that things are going to be lost. And the two, because he is so, has this sort of mental conditions, they squeeze out everything. So there's no present. He cannot live in the present. Everything's either what he's lost or what he's anxious that he's going to lose. And this book plays around with time and understanding of time, because it involves a physicist. It also involves a writer, and they're sort of writing each other's narratives. It's just really, really clever. 5 stars. And on to Audrey Magee's The Undertaking. So, as I say, Audrey Magee wrote The Colony, and I was interested to see what her debut was like. And this is, interestingly, a book about World War II from the Germans' point of view. It starts off with a German soldier surrounded by his buddies, sort of pledging to marry an absent wife. She's back in Berlin. He's on the Eastern Front, and he's never met her. He's never seen her. He's got a photo of her. It's like a sort of a bridal scheme that the Nazis set up to, have lots of Teutonic babies born. And the reason he's doing it is because it will give him honeymoon leave to quit the front. So he goes, he gets his leave, and he meets his wife, and obviously they don't, initially they're not spiking off each other, but actually they do come to love each other. But he has to return to the front. And then it becomes a very, I know, I studied history at university. I know quite a lot about the Russian campaign during World War II. And this is very well researched, and plots the sort of the decline of Nazi Germany as the tide of the war turns. It's really good on the Battle of Stalingrad, which basically turned the tide of the war, because 1/3 of the German army was sort of captured or wiped out at the siege of Stalingrad, and she's done her homework on it. But that was less engaging than she's quite a remarkable thing. She makes you sympathetic for these the family are not Nazis, but they're living in Nazi Germany and they're getting by playing the game, by sucking up to the Nazis. And, she does make you feel for them as their fortunes become sort of worse and worse, as the whole of Germany's fortunes becomes worse and worse. And that's quite impressive. The dialogue is really good. One thing Magee is fantastic actually, in The Colony and in this, her dialogue is brilliant. Whether it's a conversation between soldiers on the front, or whether it's a conversation between the married woman, the woman who becomes the wife, and her parents, who are a different generation. She's very, she's desperate to leave home. So there's a lot of sort of tension in those conversations, or whether it's a dialogue of the parties that the upper class people enriched by the Nazis, that this family managed to sort of glom onto, they get invited to, but they're out of their depth class-wise. The dialogue is just seamless. It doesn't matter what the setting is of who's involved in the dialogue. She pulls it off. I mean, she's really, really good at dialogue. And it's a book about social class, economic wealth versus, lesser and sort of snobbery versus aspiration. It does all those things. So although the stuff on the front, when it's following the soldier, is maybe less engaging because you've read it lots and lots of times before in other novels, the stuff back home with his wife left at home, living with her family, and they increasingly have to take to the air raid shelters and things like that, that is actually much more engaging and much more well done. So this was terrific. This is 5 stars. Now, this is Violeta among the stars. When I reviewed something like, now what is it? Bedraggling Grandma with Russian Snow by João Reis, who's a Portuguese author. There was a fantastic discussion in the comments below about what is the best or most interesting Portuguese contemporary writing, and this was highly recommended. Once it was Women in Translation Month, this fit that perfectly. And in a way, it's like Elif Shafak's 10 minutes and 38 seconds in this complicated or strange world, whatever it's called, but a much more successful version, I think, because that book really, really annoyed me. And the reason that book annoyed me is because the premise of it was a woman who had died and was thrown in a trash bin, a dumpster. Her brain was still active for 10 minutes and 38 seconds after her death, which is supposedly the longest recorded in real life of brain activity after death. And in that, her life flashes before her eyes, and it doesn't flash. It's written in this beautiful prose. And that's what annoyed me, because it worked against its own conceit of calling a book 10 minutes 38 seconds. Here, an obese woman, who's a sort of perfume sales lady, has a car accident. The car tips over, so she's upside down, and she's also dying unless someone comes to save her. It's in the middle of this huge storm, so it's unlikely that people are out on the roads and will casually discover her. So she's sort of doing the same thing as the one in Elif Shafak's book, but here the language is much more sort of bang, 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 fractured, repetitive. So her life flashes before her, and it's constructed in the same way as the Elif Shafak's character was, but through the way the sentences and the language, it's much more credible. And the main characters is this woman, her parents, who she was rebelled against as a child, her own daughter, who she loves and says is because this woman is obese and everything, hates herself, but she says the one thing in life that's good is her own daughter. But her daughter, they have conflict. And the strange man who lives with them, who may or may not be the daughter's father, but who is definitely the half-brother of the obese woman, because there was an illicit below-stairs affair, because one of the things this book is about is class and domestic servants and their masters. So he's definitely the mother's half, the mother of this. Sorry, she's definitely this woman's half brother, but is he also the father of her beloved daughter? And it starts off really fascinating. She's a complete slut. She picks up truckers at truck stops, and that's brilliantly evoked in the writing. Then it moves much more onto the domestic front, stuff about her parents when she was growing up as a child, and also her relationship with her daughter and this strange man. It's slightly less engaging. I mean, still good. I just felt it went on too long. This is a 450-page book or something. I thought it could have been done less than that. That it started off so well with the crash itself. Then how she picked, before the crash, she'd picked up this trucker. I thought, well, that was just absolutely fantastic writing. And then it just dribbled away some of its tension, but still excellent. 4.5 stars. And on to my other women in translation. This is Unica Zurn, who was a German painter and author. Now, I've read her other two books, which are Trumpets of Jericho and Dark Spring. I would say that she committed suicide. She was beset by mental illness all her life. This, The Man of Jasmine, was her debut novel. And all of her writing is reasonably autobiographical, more of which in a minute. So when she was a 6-year-old child, she was already beset by visions, and she envisioned this adult man who would protect her, because she had this sort of great periods of being isolated, because her father was a colonial worker who was always often away in Africa, and that really bothered the young girl, that they were separated. She was also later raped by her brother. So even at age 6, she has, in sort of visions, married this guy, this adult man, and he will protect her. And her mental conditions are all set off when, as an adult, she meets the guy from her dreams, the exact doppelganger, and that begins her mental decline. And he's the man in Jasmine. It's largely a story of her sort of bouts in and out of mental hospitals, and how she sort of came to be taken there, because she was sort of found on the street in various states that caused alarm, that led her to being taken to the police stations or straight to the mental hospitals. And it's brilliantly, again, evocative. You really get an understanding of what it's like to have these mental conditions. I mean, she mentioned schizophrenia, but it seems to me more like manic depression, as was then, obviously, is now bipolar. And what's remarkable is the detail with which she can recreate things from her mania states and her depression. She never seemed to stop writing during these states, or if she did, she was managed to recreate them when she was in sort of better states of mental health. The detail is incredible. The detail of these asylums, the detail of how the police handled her, and the detail of the art that sometimes she made while incarcerated in these places. It's extraordinary. She strikes me, in a way, this book is a cross between William Blake, in the sense of having those visions, those very real visions, sort of driving everything about your life, including your art. Only for her, there's no sort of religious or spiritual, well, there is a spiritual, but not a God spiritual aspect of it. So it very much reminded me of that. And also, obviously, the other two books of hers that I've read. I mean, I'm a fan. I mean, there's not much else to read, because as I say, she was mainly a painter, and she was incapacitated a lot of her life. So I've pretty much read all there is. The other text, again, there's a text about a stay in another asylum. There's a text about a game that she invents with this mystery man in Jasmine, which is a sort of power/love game. They're really, really germane. In fact, it was only the very last text, which I didn't really get much out of, called In Ambush, which seems to be a sort of meshing of Melville, who's a big hero to her, with Rashomon, and she sort of comes up with this sort of fantasy scenario where these two inhabit the same world. That I didn't find as successful, but nonetheless, 5 stars. Everything I've read by this woman is 5 stars. And on to The Black Locomotive by Rian Hughes. So there are 3 sort of parts of this book interweaving in and out of one another, and I really, really like one, and the other 2 left me fairly indifferent. So unlike XX, which for me was an absolute 5-star read, this is very much using similar visual and graphic techniques, but I think to less... Well, actually, no, they were the most successful parts of the book in a way, but the book as a whole didn't hold together as much as XX did. So there is tunnelling beneath London for what is called the Crossrail project, which is a railway line linking the sort of coast on the east through all of London, passing throughout the 49 miles width of London, and then out to the west to sort of beyond suburbs. And interestingly, that has only just opened this year, or parts of it. It's not fully open, but it's finally functioning. It's been hugely controversial because of the spiralling costs and why is London getting all the infrastructure when other parts of the country need it. Anyway, and the tunnelling project hits what's called anomaly 36. So all the previous anomalies are sort of, because London is so old, they keep finding things in its soil, such as burial grounds or Roman villas, all this sort of, and they have to stop each time and do an archaeological assessment whether it needs to be preserved, and etc, etc. But anomaly 36 is none of that. It's essentially this sort of metal structure that as the borer drill bit into it, it massively increased the structure of the drill, and they had to shut it down. They thought it would, explode or whatever. And the people on this project are trying to, take a decision as where do they go to next? Can they restart the project? And one of the people seconded to this project is an artist called Rutherford, and he's the most interesting character. He makes collages of London out of material found on London pavements or the mud by the Thames or whatever. And he's a very odd character. And he manages, because as they try and breach this structure, it releases these gases, but Rutherford manages to go in as they manage to shut the doors, or the doors automatically shut, and everyone else is outside. So Rutherford is inside this structure, whereupon he explores this sort of huge empty, but very diverse, it's all about materials, and a lot of the visual plates are about materials and structures and the machines that work them, and I found that the most interesting, because before he gets locked into this thing, his work is a critique of modernist architecture and sort of brutalist architecture that is increasingly taking over London. And I thought all of that was brilliantly done, because it's not lecturing you, it's done through the visuals, through his own collage work. It's done really, really well. The unfortunate thing is the other characters and the plot are less involving. So I don't think it's a spoiler. It turns out that this structure is a spacecraft that has crashed many years before, London became a city and stuff. And it's one of those spacecrafts where the pilot and the spacecraft have an organic relationship, and just by the power of thought, the pilot can steer the spaceship. And this is what Rutherford sort of inherits and discovers. The one interesting point about the science fiction element is that it crashed because it was fighting a war between two alien species, but they weren't using weapons. What they were doing is they were changing the nature of reality. They were breaking the laws of physics, or reimagining the laws of physics and psychically projecting them to the other lot, so they could no longer have solid ground, as it were, and that time is manipulated. And I thought all of that was really interesting, but actually underplayed. So the science fiction element is fine. Half of it is you've seen it before, the other half is interesting. But what, for me, is the reason I didn't get on with this book that well, is because the third element, the Black Locomotive, is there's a storyline of the two head of the actual tunnelling project are train spotters or locomotive buffs, steam train buffs. And while I acknowledge those people exist, I don't think they bear the weight to hold the centre of a novel, and a novel with literary pretensions, even though there's lots of graphic elements. At the end of the day, it's a kid's hobby. Even if some people of Arrested Development, apologies to train spotters, continue that love and that hobby into adulthood, as characters do here. So there was a lot of stuff about steam trains and trains in the war that I just wasn't interested in. I wasn't engaged in at all. And it seemed a bit like sort of a nod to those sort of, Boy Scout adventure books. Again, I'm I have no interest in them whatsoever. I will say that going back to the critique of modernism and of this thing lying beneath the core of London, reminded me of J.G. Ballard's work. It reminded me of Chronic City by Jonathan Lethem in a good way. That there's this point of well, obviously architecture is man-made and man-designed. And that influences how people live because of the spaces that they're asked to inhabit. But equally, that architecture itself feeds back on the nature of the city. It defines the city. It cuts both ways. Again, part of this sort of critique of modernism stuff. So that side was really good. But it was a bit of a chore to read parts of it. 3.5 stars. And on to Looker by Laura Sims. So Laura Sims was the fangirl who started correspondence with David Markson, who, as you know, is my favourite writer. I wanted to read something of Laura Sims after I read the correspondence. Her poetry is really hard to get hold of. I'm really struggling to get hold of it. But I did find that she'd written this novel in 2021 called Looker. And it's a fairly serviceable book. I really would rather read her poetry. I mean, for a poet, the language in here is not very stretching at all. It's a sort of stalker story of a woman in New York in a very sort of exclusive apartment, or what do they call them? Lots, where you have, anyway. She can't seem to sort of get pregnant enough, whereby the baby is sustainable. Eventually her husband leaves her, not because of that, but because her behaviour, or their behaviour, just declines under the pressure. And an actress who lives in this same lot becomes the sort of the subject and the focus of her life. And she sort of demonstrates stalker behaviour, but it's like, oh, this actress is beautiful, she has 3 kids, and she doesn't want for anything. She has chefs and maids and all of this, Why does she get all the best things in life and I get none of them, kind of thing. And she sort of partly becomes like her. She dresses like her at the annual where they all come together for a party. But it's described as creepy. I mean, it is, I suppose, but it didn't do anything for me. I say perfectly serviceable, 3 stars, but I really do want to read her poetry, so I'm not judging her. It's not like, oh, I'm not going to pick anything else up by her. Far from it. I do want to get hold of her poetry. Just to give you an idea, I ordered one of her poetry books in May, and it still hasn't been delivered. Okay, as to what I'm currently reading. So, Anthony Mara's new book just came out. Mercury Pictures, or came out in the UK. I know it's been out a bit earlier in the States, I think. Mercury Pictures presents. I'm buddy reading this with Zena at Beating Around the Books. We're going to take 8 days to read it. The Revolution According to Raimundo Matta by Gina Apostol. So this is my 3rd Apostol novel. She's Filipino, and all her books are about sort of the modern history of Philippines, but done in really, really interesting ways. She's not didactic. She's quite experimental, and this is well on the way to doing it in yet a different way from her other 2 books that I read. And finally, Blake Butler's new book, Xanax, or Annex. It's Blake Butler. I'm only 70 pages into this. I'm also reading a book that I thought was going to be part of my Women in Translation by a Moldovan writer. It's called Bessarabian Nights. But it turns out that she came to the UK when she was 18 and she wrote this book in English. So unfortunately it can't. But I'm ploughing on with it. And then the 3rd and final book that I'll probably read for Women in Translation is the Booker International winning novel Tomb of Sand by Geetanjali Shree, which is originally written in Hindi. As you can see, quite a chunker, about 700 pages, something like that. I haven't started this yet, but I will be reading this in August. So, there you have it, BookTube. Sorry it's been a bit of a while. I think I'm going to be doing these Friday reads or recent reads every couple of weeks. I did them a bit more frequently before because I was reading a lot of short books. I now have no short books left. So I imagine I'll be doing these sort of wrap-ups every fortnight or so. So there you have it. Thanks very much. Till next time.